From the founders to the progressives. The emergence of modern economies capable of generating unprecedented affluence has coincided with the emergence of activist government capable of extensive taxation, spending, regulation, and macroeconomic management. You can think of that just as economic management. The United States' emergence as a world economic power in the latter half of the 19th century featured plenty of enterprising citizens seizing on the opportunities for economic advancement that the U.S. Constitution protected. But the role of the founders and their political heirs was much more direct. They built a state with the power to tax, spend, enforce, defend, and expand. Once in office, they often used the shrewd deployment of vast public lands as a substitute for taxation, but with similar effects. They and their colleagues helped create a continental nation linked by infrastructure, governed by a federal legal system, and boasting the most educated workforce in the world. This trajectory was a reflection of the Constitution's purpose and design, not, as many today charge, a betrayal of them. The leading statesmen who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 were keenly aware of the need for effective government authority. Indeed, they had become convinced that its absence was a mortal threat to the fledgling nation. Perhaps the most influential of them all, James Madison, put the point bluntly at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, "There never was a government without force. What is the meaning of government? An institution to make people do their duty. A government leaving it to a man to do his duty or not as he pleases would be a new species of government, or rather no government at all." In designing a substitute for the loose Articles of Confederation, which had brought so much instability and vulnerability, the authors of the Constitution put in place most of the basic instruments of governance that would become the seeds of the United States economic flowering. As the country reached its centenary, however, the sapling that had grown faced stiff new winds from concentrated corporate power. What came to be known as the Gilded Age is now sometimes portrayed as a glorious time of unchecked individual initiative to which the country should aspire to return. Okay, so the Gilded Age, that would be roughly 1870s to 1900, or maybe the beginning of the 1900s. Is now sometimes portrayed as a glorious time of unchecked individual initiative to which the country should aspire to return. The lesson it actually teaches is very different, that a modern industrial economy cannot function without independent national authority. The business titans of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were skillful in ways both laudable, that is praiseworthy, and despicable, but as the economist J. Bradford DeLong has argued, they were also just plain lucky. They came along when national markets were finally possible. They benefited from public land grants and loan guarantees. They capitalized on economies of scale. Essentially, it becomes easier to do something or to produce something as a company gets bigger, which allowed early movers to bury rivals, and they then monetized future profits, either likely future profits or imagined ones, through volatile and manipulable financial markets. The monopolistic capitalism that emerged during this era was unsustainable economically, politically, and although few paid attention to it at the time, ecologically. Prior government policies had been successful in promoting development. Without them, building the railroads likely would have taken decades longer with a huge economic loss. But these policies fostered concentrated corporate power that the federal government lacked the capacity to govern effectively, and the costs to American society of that incapacity were skyrocketing. Workplace accidents soared as industrial and rail work expanded. The toxic financial assets of the era caused repeated economic crises. The social and environmental costs of industrialization were devastating. Weak and penetrated by private interests, courts provided little recourse, whether to victims of fraud, monopolies, accidents, or tainted food or medicine. And so long as government sat on the sidelines, the harms just kept multiplying. It was only a matter of time before a reaction set in, and eventually it did, in the form of the progressive movement. Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, two of the movement's most prominent figures, were distant cousins and very different men, but they shared a conviction that government had to be strengthened to rebalance American democracy and ensure broadly distributed gains. Either could have said what Teddy declared in 1910. Okay, so as maybe you know, normally you should use the last name, although that won't work in this case. So what Teddy Roosevelt said in 1910, the citizens of the United States must effectively control the mighty commercial forces which they have called into being. Theodore Roosevelt would not live to see that goal achieved during his lifetime. The list of major reforms enacted in the first 2 decades of the 20th century under Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson is long: the enfranchisement of women, the direct election of senators, the nation's first income tax, workers' compensation, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and the first restrictions on money in politics, the first serious attempts at environmental preservation, and extensive new national regulations, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which laid the foundation for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Yet Roosevelt died in 1919 on the eve of another decade of financial speculation and runaway inequality, during which public authority decayed while problems festered, until, of course, an economic crisis made continued inaction untenable once again. Okay, so that would be the Great Depression. Picking up where Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson had left off, Franklin Roosevelt put into place a broad range of policies that inserted government deeply into previously untouched areas of the U.S. political economy. The New Deal brought tougher financial oversight, including the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. With the National Labor Relations Act, it brought organized labor into the mixed economy's emerging system of countervailing power. With the Social Security Act, it introduced a widely popular system of social insurance that would protect the American middle class from some of the risks associated with modern capitalism. And with the emerging national system of taxes and spending, the New Deal added to the growing toolkit of macroeconomic management that would prevent or moderate future economic downturns. Despite the interregnum, okay, there's a word you don't see too often, a pause or interruption. So despite the interruption of the 1920s, therefore, it makes sense to think of the two Roosevelts as bookending a long progressive era. It was progressive because at crucial moments, nearly everyone in a position of high public leadership came to believe that the U.S. social contract needed updating. It was long because challenging entrenched elites proved difficult. Okay, I think by long, the authors mean it took a long time because challenging entrenched elites proved difficult, and only persistent agitation and huge disruption to the U.S. political order allowed the translation of these new beliefs into new governing arrangements. The heyday of the mixed economy, the progressives set out to rescue capitalism, not replace it. The academic who oversaw the development of the Social Security Act, Edwin Witt, said of it, "Only to a very minor degree did the act modify the distribution of wealth, and it does not alter at all the fundamentals of our capitalistic and individualistic economy. The welfare state softened the sharp edges of capitalism without tightening restrictions on economic dynamism. At the core of the new system that emerged was an exchange. The government would take much larger amounts of money from citizens than ever before, and then it would turn around and spend that money on various projects that benefited those same citizens, both individually and collectively. Before the 20th century, income taxes had barely existed in the United States, and before World War II, they had brought in no more than 2% of national income. By 1943, they raked in 11%, and the share of the population paying them skyrocketed from 7% to 64%. At first, most of the money went to the war effort, of course, but research in universities and industrial labs also benefited, and as scientists flocked to U.S. universities, that is from, in particular, Europe, before and during World War II. Okay, so as scientists flocked to U.S. universities to join the action, Young Americans poured into college with funding from the GI Bill. Rivaling these investments in research and education, both in scale and in social return, were vast government outlays for highways, airports, waterways, and other forms of infrastructure. The interstate highway system began with Dwight Eisenhower's 1956 National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, which dedicated over $200 billion in current dollars and hiked the nationwide gas tax to provide highway financing. New Deal programs devoted to economic security expanded as well. With Eisenhower's strong support, Congress extended Social Security to cover almost all Americans and made it generous enough to pull more of the elderly out of poverty, even as disability protections were added. National health insurance, proposed by President Harry Truman, but opposed by the growing private healthcare industry, never made it to the floor of Congress. Okay, so that looks like crony capitalism, if you remember what that is. But wartime wage and price controls that permitted supplemental benefits. So during World War II, there was a limit to how much you could, I'm not sure in all cases, but in many cases, pay someone, but you could still make someone's overall pay package more attractive by giving them benefits. So for instance, healthcare benefits, which is primarily why healthcare is now tied into employment. The spread of collective bargaining and tax breaks for health insurance helped push private coverage up to an eventual peak of around 3/4 of Americans by the mid-1970s. The federal government also subsidized and regulated private pensions that built on top of Social Security. As these tax breaks suggest, the new U.S. state was no unchecked leviathan. It commingled public and private spending, direct outlays and indirect subsidies, central direction and decentralized implementation. It fostered pluralistic competition for funds among researchers, contractors, and private intermediaries, as well as among states and localities. But it was enormously active and enormously successful, and soon its rewards would extend to new groups that had yet to feel the warm sun of American prosperity. In expanding rights for women and minorities through statutes, judicial action, and the government's own example, most profoundly in the armed services, the nation was finding money on the table. Okay, so finding money on the table means, well, to back up a second, so when you allow women and minorities, in particular African Americans, or not just allow them, but don't prevent them from getting something like a quality education and then doing the job for which they are most qualified, when you let that happen, that of course benefits the women and the African Americans and other minorities, but it also helps society. You have people who are doing jobs which they're qualified for, and so that's going to mean, better research or better production of goods and services, more efficient production of goods and services. And so just by letting people essentially get the education and do the jobs that they should be doing, you're getting more productivity. So that's the finding money on the table. That productivity was there, but until you started letting women and minorities do more things, that money was just being left on the table, and this, to use this way of speaking. But then once you let these people do these kinds of things, then you can actually get at that money, i.e. get at that untapped productivity. Okay, government policies also boosted the skills and opportunities of the least advantaged, where the returns on such investments were highest. As the federal government expanded, it did not merely extend opportunities to individuals on the periphery of prosperity. It also extended opportunities to places on the periphery, especially in the South, injecting assistance and employment, housing and highways, development projects, and defense jobs into regions previously left behind by modern economic growth. As the post-war period wore on, U.S. leaders made another vital contribution to the country's rising prosperity, pushing to address market failures associated with an increasingly dense, interconnected, and complex commercial society. The most obvious breakthroughs concerned pollution, which rapidly came to be seen as a fundamental threat to quality of life, requiring vigorous regulation. The federal government also improved protections for worker safety, and in response to the growing profile of activists such as Ralph Nader, paid much more attention to vulnerable consumers in areas as diverse as tobacco and automobiles, using the power of the state to protect citizens from the predation of others and to limit the potential damage from their own myopic choices, such as smoking cigarettes or failing to wear a seatbelt. The story of the United States' rise to richness is a story of an ongoing rebalancing of political institutions and economic realities, of public policies, social knowledge, and democratic demands. But the arc of that history bends toward a more extensive role for government, and for good reason. As the United States changed from an agricultural society to an industrial society, and then to a post-industrial society, the scale of economic activity and the interdependence and complexity of that activity grew, and so did the resulting damage. Okay, the damage, I think, is what we were talking about at the bottom of 79 and the top of page 80. As the nation's leaders responded to these challenges and to pressures for action and inclusion from below, they came to recognize that making Americans healthier, better educated, and freer to pursue their own dreams, regardless of race, gender, and ethnicity, whatever the circumstances of their birth, made America richer too.